I wish I could send a picture of this to my 22-year-old self and say, stop freaking out. It's gonna be okay. I was graduating from college, like a nice liberal arts college where I got an education where you learn how to learn, whatever that means. And I studied political science because I had to graduate on time. And really the most engaging thing that I'd done all 4 years in college was write a column about food for the school newspaper. And, I'd heard loosely that people make a living from writing about food, and I thought, okay, well that could be really cool, but I have no idea how to go about it. A lot of my friends are, going off to medical school or law school, and I'm sort of faced with this big black void in front of me. And I was like, oh gosh, what am I gonna do? And the only thing I could do was not fear it and just dive into it and see what happens. And I went on a trip, and one conversation led to another, and I talked to a woman who was cooking. And what I realized in that conversation was, yes, I wanted to write about food, or I wanted to have a career in, food storytelling, but I didn't want to write about it with just an opinion. I wanted to have an opinion that I would respect, and the opinions that I respected were the opinions that came from people who, had been in the trenches, had been real cooks and real chefs and food writers like Paula Wolfert, Diana Kennedy, the legends, Jacques Pepin. I mean, obviously I knew it wasn't going to be just like them, but I wanted to know what it was like and know food from like an intimate perspective. So I, through this friend in San Francisco, got an apprenticeship in an Italian restaurant. And it was a humbling experience, to say the least. I went from a place where adults, really treat you like you have something interesting to say, or at least they pretend like you have something interesting to say, to a kitchen where I was basically the village idiot. And I learned a really important lesson, when you're really trying to break into a field where you have no experience, you do whatever you can to help out. If somebody hands you a broom, you're not overqualified to sweep, you sweep. And I swept for quite some time, and then I cut vegetables, and things sort of moved along. And that 3-month apprenticeship, I probably learned more in 3 months than I learned in 4 years of college. I'm sorry, Dad, that you had to spend all that money. But it's kind of true. I learned a lot of interesting, wonderful life lessons. I went on to cook some more, and after a year of cooking, I realized that maybe cooking behind the line wasn't what I was meant to do. But I was still really interested in food, and there was still sort of more to explore. So I walked into a bakery, the best bakery I'd ever been to in my life, that made the best bread I'd ever tasted. And I, handed them my resume. It was a little thin, but I was like, I know how to sweep, and use a knife. I don't know anything about baking, but I quickly sort of fell into line, and I got a job making tart shells, which wasn't terribly interesting, but my goal was the bread. So I really diligently made the tart shells, and I think the owner sort of noticed that, and I struck up a friendship with him, and I became his third apprentice in bread making. And he'd been baking by himself for 15 years, and I was number 3. And we kind of had this deal. I taught him how to surf, and he taught me how to make bread. And it was wonderful. Bread there's 3 ingredients in bread. It's flour, water, and salt. And if you hand flour and water and salt to 20 different bakers, you're gonna get 20 different loaves of bread. It's that sort of personal, and the details and the nuances of fermenting a dough. I mean, it just opened a world that I really had no consciousness of. And I just dove, I became obsessed. I became completely obsessed. I baked at home. It was kind of like a Japanese-style apprenticeship. He wouldn't let me touch the dough for a month. I was sweeping, of course. After a year of baking and working at Tartine, the bakery's Tartine, more on that in a minute, I started to get a little restless. My dream after college was to travel around and maybe write a cookbook about my experiences. So I packed my bags with a chef knife, a bread starter, and I started a blog. And what you see is sort of like a time capsule. It actually still exists as it is. And I knew that in order to tell stories about food, I would have to have interesting experiences, but I'd also have to show people the food. And you can write about food all you want, but nothing really beats a picture. So I bought a camera. It was just about the time when digital cameras became a little more affordable, and I took off and kind of, took really seriously the idea that I had to get in there and get a good story. And my parents were always like, you need to post more on your blog. And I was like, no, but it has to be good. And I would labor over it, and I would only, put out the 3 photos that I thought were halfway decent. One thing college does teach you is how to ruthlessly edit your work. That was a good lesson. And I think that definitely carries over to photography as well. I went from Chile to the northeastern tip of Colombia and had some really interesting food experiences, got myself into the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta with the Arhuaco Indians and the FARC rebels. It was kind of intense, and I was like, oh, no food journalist has ever gone here before. Gourmet magazine's gonna call me up and want a feature. No, they didn't. This is me cooking Thanksgiving dinner. I called my parents, I'm not coming home for Thanksgiving. I've got this amazing opportunity. I spent Thanksgiving in the mountains. That's Teti Gutierrez, sort of the patriarch of this coffee finca. And it was wonderful. And I came home to crickets, really. I was just about as directionless as when I left. Until Chad called me a couple weeks later and was like, hey, you want to come back to San Francisco and bake with me? And I was like, yeah, I do. I was just his apprentice, but now he wanted me to pay me to bake the bread. So I was like, yes, I'm coming. And the minute I got back, or the day I got back, we went out to dinner and he told me about this bread book idea that he had, that he wanted to write a book on bread, and would I be interested in working on it with him? Yes, I would be. Sort of seemed like this unexpected, yes. Gourmet wasn't paying attention, but Chad was, and that was, a turning point. And as we sort of started to write the proposal, I think he had this intuition that maybe his buddy who knew the bread more intimately than almost anybody else might do a good job photographing his book as well. So he asked me to photograph the book. And yes, I will photograph the book. I know nothing about food photography. I know nothing about photography in general, but I know a lot about bread. And I spent the next 2 years sort of, figuring it out. Our goal was to really put the reader by the baker's side and show them sort of in photos as best we could how to bake the bread. We kind of wanted to write a recipe without words, but that didn't quite work so well. It's a 38-page recipe for how to make bread. Most of it's photography, and we try to use words where we have to point out some of the nuances. This is me figuring it out. I would lose photos. I would show up to work with a dead battery. Of course, I only had one battery back then. Any professional has 6. But I think I figured out the one important thing, the trick with food photography, at least to start, is to turn off all the overhead lights and put the food next to a window. And Tartine was blessed with 5 o'clock sun that would bounce off a cream-colored building across the street and flood the kitchen with this warm, soft light. And I was like, oh, that looks good. I'm gonna stick with that. So, the bread book really was an exploration of the nuance of bread. I wasn't so much focused on the quality of the photography. Of course I was, but it was more how do we communicate, the bread at its essence. And the book came out, and it was awesome. It is widely received, and it changed the course of my life for sure. After we finished that book, I sort of decided to strike out on my own and try this weird photography thing, which to me was a crazy idea. I had like one wedding on the books 11 months out. Yes, I shot weddings. That's how I paid my rent for a long time. But then other cookbooks started to come in, and I sort of realized like, whoa, like cookbooks are a thing that like are important, and they offer you as a photographer kind of like this opportunity to tell like a real story, like with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they're all different, and they're all sort of these like interesting collaborations with like people who've spent their entire lives, devoted to like a single thing. Like Chad, he devoted his entire life to bread, and what the result was something beautiful. And so, I sort of, began to get other assignments with other interesting people, like Corey Lee, a 3 Michelin star chef in San Francisco. If you don't know what 3 Michelin stars means, it's like harder to get than like a DPReview gold. It's like super hard to get 3 Michelin stars. And the way he got it was by being like incredibly focused on all of the details. And so when he called me to shoot his book, I was like, are you sure? I do my best work when I'm like on the spot and improvising. Not exactly, I'm definitely like the opposite of that guy. But like every cookbook project that I have ever done, it started with like a creative conversation. And the conversation wasn't necessarily about how we see the book, but about how we see his story, his restaurant, his vision. And he sees himself at the crossroads between the United States and Asia. He's like, I have a distinctly American restaurant, and yes, we look, to Hong Kong and Korea, which is where he was born, for ingredients and inspiration, but what he was interested in was sort of like this exchange, right? And if you walk into the restaurant's like, it's like a monastery. It's like very quiet, and it's like there's a reverence for the food and for the cooking. And we wanted to capture that. But in this creative conversation that we had, we also decided that we wanted to, cover other things. Oh, I put that slide in there to show sort of kind of what a badass this guy is, and sort of it also explains sort of who he is as a chef. This is his faux shark fin soup. People love shark fins in Hong Kong. We're not going to get into the politics of that, but here in San Francisco, they make a faux shark fin soup. And he's figured out how to exactly sort of achieve the texture of shark fin, which is what people are really into. And he's got a cook, one guy who's sitting there cutting each individual strand of the shark fins for 80 people coming to dinner. And each end is like, like there's like a little tip at the end, which is the way the shark fin looks in real life. That just kind of gives you an idea of like the intensity with which, and sort of the thoughtfulness that goes into his food. So we had decided that we were going to set the calm, sort of meditative atmosphere of the restaurant sort of in stark relief with sort of like the gritty, sweaty, like world outside that inspires him, and that also like, that where his ingredients come from. And I'm always one to say yes to an international trip. So we decided to go to Korea, to the southern island of Jeju, where for the last like 150 years, the Haenyeo have been diving for seafood. So he gets a lot of his like dried seafood goods from the island of Jeju, which are gathered by these women. And I did a little bit of research, and I was like, I have to get in the water with these women. That would be awesome. I got in touch with a friend of mine who's a surf photographer, Todd Glazer, and asked him how to do it, and he gave me like a 5-minute, like crash course in water housing, and I was off to Korea, and got in the water. And of course, like at first, all the women were like, oh, who's this guy? He's gonna drown. And I think they thought I was gonna bring them bad luck. But once I survived, and once we were like on dry land, like things sort of got a little bit friendlier. And I think like one of the things with this project that I that maybe is like a little nugget is if you go out on the road or or you're doing anything, like it's really important to like connect with the people you're shooting. Like the camera is such a barrier, right? And I think in that previous shot, you can sort of see like the distrust of the camera. It's intense. I love that shot, but I also like this one too. I mean, that one's obviously not in the book, but we came to some sort of like beautiful understanding. And the book sort of, like as a whole, like as a physical object, really weaves together like that sort of like a calm monastery feel with, like the gritty outside world that inspires him. Not all cookbooks are full of international intrigue and adventure. I recently finished a book with Gabrielle Hamilton. She has a small restaurant in the Lower East Side of Manhattan called Prune. It's like 30 seats. The first time I walked in there a few years ago, I fell in love. I loved the decor. I loved how close you are to the people next to you. The menu's good. The people are beautiful. And I wrote her a letter. I was like, hey, you don't know me, but I'm in love with your restaurant. And if you're ever thinking about doing a cookbook, I know you did a memoir, but if you're ever thinking about doing a cookbook, please throw my name into the hat of people who are interested in photographing it. And I didn't hear back for 3 months. And then I did. And we had a meeting. And again, it was that kind of like creative conversation. Okay, what's the story? Like, what are you all about? What's the restaurant all about? And for her, it wasn't about the cafe. It was about the kitchen. It was about this basement kitchen where they make beautiful food, but really a dingy, dark basement kitchen. I think what she said to me was, if you want to photograph this cookbook, I challenge you to find the beauty in this shithole that we call a kitchen. Challenge accepted. I want to. And there is beauty and there is dignity in these like dark, cramped spaces where people spend most of their lives cooking. And I think that's what Gabrielle really wanted to communicate. And, if there was a creative direction for that entire project, it was, you're not allowed to leave my restaurant. You're not allowed to bring anything from the outside world into the restaurant. The whole book has to really tell the story of like our daily struggle and efforts to bring good food to the table. This is Gabrielle and one of my favorite shots in the book. We sort of, it's kind of grotesque in like an awesome sort of way. And I think like I've sort of been coming full circle in my photography where yes, I love shooting food on a plate, but like the thing that really gets me going is finding the like unscripted beauty of the cooking process. And I think that's like what Gabrielle really responded to. Of course, I was in love with the cafe. That was my first experience, and I wanted to, communicate that. And so there was a little bit of a creative dialogue with, what we're going to show. But she was very clear on who she is as a chef. And if that shark fin soup sort of summed up Corey Lee, the garbage sums up Gabrielle Hamilton. She really, believes in not wasting anything and in making good food from every last scrap in the kitchen. The last slide, as I sort of bring this to a close, is my favorite shot in the whole book. This is one of her line cooks as she's taking her 2-minute lunch in between services. I think it speaks to like the dedication and the passion and the sacrifice of the people who are really behind the lines cooking our food. And I think as a food photographer, my interest and like my passion is to, show food as more than something like yummy to eat on a plate and bring the whole story kind of to life. Thank you.